Hey, Nicotine, thanks for your response. Your first point about this difference between empirical observation, which is supposedly objective, and introspection, which is supposedly subjective. Um, the type of introspection that I was talking about that could provide us with valid knowledge um, is a form of trained and peer-reviewed introspection. So you've got a certain technique that multiple individuals are trained to use, a certain meditative technique. Um, they then explore this technique, they share their findings with each other, and through a process of peer review, they come to certain um, shared understandings of what the meaning of inner experience is. And certainly, the more people you get together to perform these meditative experiments, the more valid the findings will be because the sample size is bigger. Um, but in a similar way, a scientist, a microbiologist, when they look through a microscope, it requires a lot of training for them to actually distinguish the various organelles or molecules or what have you that they're looking at. The average person who looks through a microscope is not going to see what the trained scientist sees. So training is always a part of being able to gather what is called valid information, valid data from whatever phenomena you may be investigating, whether it's mental phenomena or sensory phenomena. But already I think we're erecting a false dualism here. The idea that classical empiricism, say dating back to Hume, holds that our sensory experience can be easily separated from our non-sensuous experience, from our bodily experience, I think that's incorrect. I think, Hume assumed that the world comes to us in all these different sensory impressions, atoms of bare sensa, patches of color and shapes and so forth. Whereas I think to perceive the world in that way, that's actually a product of reflection, of abstraction. In our immediate experience, our sensation and our understanding of meaning and mental possibilities aren't separate. When I see a chair over in the corner, I immediately understand it as something that I can go over and sit on. It has meaning for me. It's not just a bunch of shapes and color impressions that I have to then order through some mental imaginary act of representation or whatever. I immediately experience it as a meaningful place for me to go and engage with. Um, and the idea that it is actually patches of color and certain shapes um, pasted together by some mental act, that's an abstraction that I come to through a very difficult philosophical process of analysis, whereas my actual phenomenological experience doesn't reveal those such a sharp distinction between sensory experience and um, what we would call meaningful experience. Um, Meaningful in the sense that I see things and they call forth certain possibilities from me. Um, so we have to be careful when we talk about empiricism not to uh, assume that we only have the world as seen through the five senses, as though there's a piece of cardboard in front of us with five peepholes and that's all we have. We have a certain embodiment. We are in the world already and are, in fact, of the world itself. And so it's an abstraction to assume that all we know about the world is through our five senses. Um, Now, this example of Mario 64, certainly we can stand back and look at the screen with the 3D virtual world, um, and then the hardware with the electrons buzzing around in the circuit board, and we can see the phenomenal and the noumenal, or the actual thing. Um, we can see them both at the same time. But when it comes to our own experience, we're always already in experience. That's all we have is experience. Um, and so we never get the opportunity to step outside of it and say, oh, that's what it really is. It's really this brain. I can look at someone else's brain and say, oh, all your consciousness must be in there. But the consciousness isn't identical to the brain, because obviously, just as you could look at my brain and say, oh, it must be in here, your awareness, you can never find my awareness anywhere inside this physical object. So the principle of identity between mind and matter, I think, is slightly misleading. Whatever consciousness is, it's related to the brain, as I said, but it's also part of this process of the brain being inside of a living body, inside of a world. And consciousness is the loop of information feeding through this whole system of not only my brain in this body in the world, but our brains interacting with each other. Um, Consciousness, whatever it is not a substance. And I think it's difficult for us to avoid thinking in terms of substances, whether we think in terms of two substances, mind and matter, or in terms of one substance. Either we're idealists and we think only mind is real, or we're materialists and we think only matter is real. I'd rather throw out the whole idea of substance. I don't think modern physics supports the idea of material substance anymore, much less the idea of mental substance. We need instead a process ontology where what's real is this process of becoming, where mind and matter are sort of opposite poles in this process, and our pure experience doesn't yet distinguish between the two. A philosopher, A.N. Whitehead, would talk about this in terms of matter being the stubborn facts about the past, the actual world as we experience it here and now. The mental world is the creative possibilities which can be manifested in the future. It's the possible as opposed to the actual. Matter is the actual, mind is the possible. And we're always moving through the contrast between what is actual and what is possible. Certain things become actual, and that changes what is then possible. And when we temporalize our experience, instead of trying to understand it or reduce it to one substance or an interaction between substances or whatever, I think it becomes a lot easier to understand how consciousness allows us to make decisions, but at the same time those decisions are not contradicting what we call material laws. There are certain facts about the way the world is. Consciousness can't change them. But within those facts, it can achieve certain possibilities which are still available to it. So you also said you wanted to talk about some other things in my video that you'll get to in other videos. Causality is something that I think we should really discuss, because the idea that everything can be reduced to efficient causation is a metaphysical idea that I don't think any scientific experiment will ever be able to prove. Science depends on philosophy whenever it begins to talk about causation. And so if we engage in a philosophical discussion about causality, neuroscience can inform us, but it's no longer the sole source of authority on the matter. We have to begin to think metaphysically and to make use of different forms of experience in order to find out what causality even means. Because, time, if you're a strict materialist, is an illusion. Einstein said the difference between past, present, and future is just a persistent illusion. And yet our actual experience is obviously temporal. And any mention of causality, even efficient causality, requires time. So if time is an illusion from a materialist perspective, then even efficient causality is somehow not really real. But anyways, I'll save that for later videos if we get around to it. But I appreciate your response, and take it easy.